Okay, so everyone, you're welcome to this webinar. It's an interesting one, and we have with us Professor Jaideep Prabhu. I pronounced it properly. Yeah, he's a professor of marketing in Jawaharlal Nehru University, professor of Indian business, and the director of Center for India and Global Business, and the vice dean of faculty at faculty of faculty at George Business School, University of Cambridge. He has a PhD in business administration from the University of Southern California and a BTech from the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. He has published in leading academic journals, and his work has been profiled by the BBC, Bloomberg Business Week, The Economics, The Financial Times, Le Monde, The New York Times, and the Times. He is a co-author of Jagged Innovation, Think Frugal, Be Flexible, Generate Breakthrough Growth, described by The Economics as the most comprehensive book yet on the subject of frugal innovation. His 2015 book, Frugal Innovation, How to Do Better with Less, with Navi Rajol, won the CMI's Management Book of the Year in 2016. His most recent book, How Should a Government Be? The New Level of State Power, was published in February 2021. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2023. We have with us an interesting talk this morning. And it's also very important because we live in a country where things are we don't have everything available. And we needed to know, how do we do much with the little we have? So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite Professor Jaideep to the stage to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you this morning. As Emmanuel said, I'm a professor at the Judge Business School, which you can see in my background. And let me share some of my thoughts first, and then we can open up to conversation later. So I have spent my career studying innovation. And in the first part of my career, I studied innovation in large Western companies. And then I became interested in innovation in emerging markets like India, where I grew up. And that's when I became aware of this idea of frugal innovation. And so over the last decade or so, I have been studying this phenomenon, initially in the private sector, where I have noticed that now around the world, small teams of people, sometimes our students in universities, can innovate in ways that only large companies or the government could have done before. And we see these teams develop highly affordable solutions, faster, better, and cheaper across sectors, from telecommunications to health to education to energy and so on. And often their solutions are addressing social problems. And this is where it intersects with public services and the state. So, for instance, WhatsApp, which all of us use, was built by 4 people in a bedroom over 12 months in the US, and with a relatively small amount of funding, which then, of course, had a huge impact on all our lives. Millions of people use it. And in the end, these 4 people sold it to Facebook for $16 billion. So we see this in areas like software, but we also see it in areas like hardware. This is something I'm particularly proud of. This is one of our former students here at Cambridge, Eben Upton. Yeah, he was a part-time student. He was doing his EMBA program with us while he was teaching computer science in the computer science department of Cambridge. And he and his colleagues had noticed in the 2000s that fewer and fewer young people were applying to Cambridge to study computer science. And even the ones who did apply had never tinkered with the hardware of a computer or done any coding. So they came up with this idea of a basic computer. You can see him holding it in his hand. It's a microprocessor. He said, well, they would have to tinker. The kids, would have to tinker with this, and they'd have to code for it. And it'd be so cheap that if they broke it, it wouldn't be a big deal. And the first one was about $30, and now they even have a $5 version. They thought they would sell a few thousand units. They've sold millions. So you see this in hardware. You see this phenomenon in emerging markets. For instance, in Kenya, Vodafone introduced this service called M-Pesa in 2007 to enable a lady from rural Kenya to use her basic phone to call her son who'd be working in Nairobi, ask him how he's doing, but also to ask him to send money home in an emergency. And this is financial inclusion. So you could actually text the money to her. She could receive this money as e-float and cash it in her local corner shop, which was an M-Pesa agent. And this is sort of frugal financial inclusion because it's done without creating any new assets. People already had mobile phones. They were used to texting. There are corner shops in their village. Basically, Vodafone joins the dots and creates this service. And we see this phenomenon in the developed world as well. This is a spin-out company from the University of California at Berkeley called CellScope. And CellScope makes a whole suite of medical devices like this otoscope that you see in the picture that plugs into the audio jack of the smartphone and enables a mother to do telemedicine. So here the mother can take high resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter when she has an infection and send the images to a consultant who's somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone medical device. And of course, it enables telemedicine, and they've come up with a suite of other devices like dermoscopes and so on. So my colleagues and I, my co-authors and I, we wrote a book called Jugaad Innovation, which was about this phenomenon in emerging markets, in India, other Asian countries, African economies, Latin America. This book was all about how, other countries from the West could learn from emerging markets on how to innovate faster, better, cheaper when you have resource constraints. And this book came out in 2012. After it came out, there was a lot of interest in this idea of frugal innovation in developed countries for developed economies. So my co-author and I looked at that phenomenon, and then we wrote a follow-up book, which was called Frugal Innovation, which was all about how Western companies were adopting these techniques of doing things faster, better, and cheaper in the West. And that book, this one, came out in 2015. And so in the years, from 2012 onwards, I would talk a lot about these two books, which are all about the private sector. And whenever I was talking to any kind of audience, people would often ask me, or they would talk about some of the dark side, because I was generally celebrating this kind of innovation. But people would point out, that this is also creating monopoly power, concentration of wealth. There were some negative externalities. And people would also say, what does this phenomenon mean for governments, and I think by that they meant two things. One is, how can governments themselves adopt this kind of innovation to be able to deliver for their citizens faster, better, cheaper? But also, what is the role of government to nurture, to cultivate, and to regulate this kind of innovation in society so that we get the positive benefits without the negative externalities? So then I began to think about what this meant for governments. And in 2021, I published a third book called How Should a Government Be, which was all about this idea of how governments should innovate. And so when I was researching for that book, I realized there was a very long debate, about 100 years debate, between two camps. The libertarians, who tend to be very skeptical of government, who generally believe that governments are inefficient and ineffective at best and dangerous at worst, and they sort of look to scale down the role of government. And on the other hand, you have the statists who are very positive about government. They tend to believe that governments are the only force that can deal with some of the injustices or vagaries of nature or the market. And so, while I was reading this, I realized, of course, there's an element of truth to both these extreme positions. But actually, there's a huge space in between where governments actually operate in practical terms. There are many, many things that governments have to do these days, and the list keeps growing longer. But they have to do that within budgets. So the question is, how can governments be effective and efficient, but of course, without trampling on people's freedoms? And how can they do that both in times of stability as well as in times of crisis like pandemics or financial crises? And what I wanted to do in this book was not just look at these abstract arguments and discussions, but actually look at what was happening in government around the world. So I have lots of cases, and the book opens with a case that I was particularly familiar with because it's from India, where the Indian government in 2009 initiated a very ambitious project to give every Indian a unique 12-digit number, which would be their ID, linked to their fingerprints and to their iris scan. And they invited somebody, this person here in the picture, from the private sector, a software entrepreneur, to come into government to lead this initiative. And it was extremely successful. The government was able to issue, practically every Indian now has this unique ID, and they were able to do it in about 5 years at less than $1 an ID. And in the first year that they linked this ID system to the government benefits system, where they transfer benefits, cash subsidies, pensions, scholarships, etc., to people, when they linked it to the unique ID and did it directly through people's bank transfers, they were immediately able to eliminate a huge amount of fraud in the system where people had fake IDs before. And that in that first year alone, the government was able to save more than the entire program cost the government. So in the book, when I discuss this, I conclude that there are examples like this of very large scale projects where the government can be efficient and effective, but of course it creates other problems that the system has to think about. Problems of whenever you're dealing with data and digital, you have to think about the privacy of that data, the security of that data, and so on. So, based on that, in the book, I then look at how states can be more effective and efficient by using new technologies, often these ubiquitous technologies like digital technologies, mobiles, and so on, but also new forms of government, of organization. And I argue that if governments are able to use technologies and these forms of organization, they can be efficient and effective, but they have to adopt some principles of operation. So, one is governments have to start being more responsive, they have to be inclusive and include people who are typically left behind by these programs. They have to experiment, they have to be entrepreneurial, and they have to create a culture of innovation. So let me talk about each of these with some examples. By being responsive, I mean the government has to think, be citizen centric. They have to actually start with the citizen's problem from the citizen's perspective and only then design a solution. So it should be outside in, as opposed to the typical tendency of government, which is inside out. We'll decide something and then you just have to do what we tell you. And I argue that governments could be better off actually involving citizens, not only in identifying and understanding the problem, but also developing and implementing the solutions. And the example I give is of public services like social care. I give an example from the Netherlands, where there has been a very successful move towards community led social care. This is care of elderly people in their homes or in hospitals, neighborhood hospitals. This organization called Beardsog that I cover in my book completely changed the way social services was done and made it very much patient centric. So they would have a small team of frontline workers who would work with the community over a period of time with aged people in their community, in their homes, building relationships, developing and delivering services and care for patients, and aided by simple digital technologies like iPads and a very simple interface. And they would have a very light touch back office or administrative office. So that saved a lot of money, and they could put all their resources into the frontline service. So that's the first principle. The second principle is this one about being inclusive and how governments need to balance the interests of different groups of citizens. And I look at social security and how in Denmark, the government over many years and many decades, in fact, has managed to balance the needs of employers who would like to have a flexible labor market to be able to hire and fire easily, while also ensuring that the people who are hired and fired, the job seekers, when they are fired, they have some social security, they have a safety net, but they're also trained very quickly or retrained very quickly to go back into the workforce. And another initiative that I look at is the universal basic income, where governments around the world, and actually at different levels, including city levels, have been experimenting with giving people a basic income, regardless of their background. And the idea is that that provides not only a safety net, but also gives people some cash, for instance, to be entrepreneurs. And one of the arguments is that it will help entrepreneurial activity, particularly in economies where AI might disintermediate or reduce their labor opportunities in the workforce. Uh, Now, many have been tried. The question is, do they actually work? And in theory, you can have arguments for why they would work and why they wouldn't work. So it's important to look at what the evidence says. And that leads me to my third principle, which is the need for states. Just like companies are often experimental and do things like A/B testing and so on, the state needs to try out new solutions in pilots to reduce the risk of failure, to learn, evaluate what the evidence suggests, and then if it suggests that it's working, to scale it. And here I look at an example from the UK, which is the Behavioral Insights team. This was a small unit set up in the Cabinet Office in 2010 to essentially use psychological insights and behavioral economics insights to be able to guide government activities. For instance, the letters that the tax department sends out to people who might have a private income, to remind them that they need to declare their private income in time. Typically, these letters were generic letters. The Behavioral Insights team customized them to have very specific targeted messages to people, including using social influence, saying, okay, if you're a doctor, many doctors like you, 80% of doctors report their income on time, things like that. And they then did an experiment, a field experiment, and they saw that the response improved with these targeted, simple behavioral insights. And so they went on to create something called the What Works groups, where the What Works groups look at all the evidence in an area, let's say like education. They look at evidence around all kinds of interventions, like do uniforms improve educational outcomes? Do smaller class sizes improve these outcomes? What about having a spare teacher? All that kind of stuff. They look at all that evidence across the world, and they provide a simple kind of a spreadsheet kind of um, resource for policymakers to assess and evaluate how to make decisions. And not just policymakers, also people in schools. So it's like a dashboard that principals and teachers can use to influence their own decisions in their schools. Then the fourth principle is the state being entrepreneurial. Um, and this can be true both in how it regulates the economy, but also how it cultivates the economy. And I argue that states need to be proactive and engage early when there are new technologies coming out. So this is exactly what the Kenyan Central Bank did with M-Pesa. When Vodafone approached them, they engaged early. They identified what the issues of concern to them were. They got an independent consultant to do research on this new product. And then when they were comfortable with the findings, they gave a letter of no objection for M-Pesa to proceed. And that was very successful. Another example I give is from the UK, which has been trying to promote autonomous vehicles, driverless cars. And one way that they promoted it was very early on to have a very clear but simple regulation, simple set of rules for what people who, companies that wanted to test autonomous vehicles on actual roads would need to follow, what guidance they would need to follow. And the second aspect of the state being entrepreneurial is how the state can cultivate or encourage this kind of innovation in the economy. This is what we might call industrial strategy. And again, looking at autonomous vehicles in the UK, the government has small pots of money which issue challenges to different types of companies to come together to bid for these grants to be able to then do their testing on British roads. And the idea here is to get consortia to work together of large and small car companies, insurance companies, telecoms companies, and universities. And this really drives innovation and research in the early stage. And we also see that kind of approach now in the space race in the US with NASA working with companies like SpaceX and Boeing and so on, but also in other countries like China and India. And the idea is that the state in cultivating the economy shouldn't seek to try and do everything itself. Rather, it should create the rules or the framework. It should steer and let the private sector and entrepreneurs and citizens do the rowing. Now, let me talk briefly about digital public infrastructure because this is how the space has evolved in countries like India in the last few years after I wrote the book. So, I mentioned this unique ID that India initiated in 2009, and all Indians have that. But that has become the basis of something called India Stack, which has enabled huge financial inclusion. It has enabled electronic KYC, which is what banks need to do, know your customer. And then they've created on top of it something called the Unified Payments Interface, which is a set of interoperable open source APIs that enable any company to come in to create an app to enable mobile banking. And so this whole India stack enables digital identity verification, cashless financial transactions, secure data sharing, and digital document storage. And together, these elements lower the costs of market-based exchange and increase trust. And this has created huge financial inclusion in India and a case for digital public goods. So a case for states to introduce, like in the past, they would build roads, but now to build these digital roads, which include things like open APIs, which are interoperable and modular. This is a frugal design. This creates financial inclusion, as I said, because it makes services like mobile banking very affordable and accessible on the demand side. But on the supply side, these APIs create a lot of opportunities for fintech startups to get involved. And that has been a huge driver of entrepreneurship in India. And of course, what the state needs to do is to have regulation to ensure privacy and security. So that thinking, which was very successful in financial services, has now been extended to uh, transaction networks like e-commerce. And the idea is that we have, initially e-commerce was inspired by the principles of the internet and GPS and so on, which was that anyone was in principle able to not only talk to anyone else on the internet, but also do transactions, to do commercial transactions. But what happened was that we had these very big platforms that inserted themselves between you and me. Platforms like Amazon, for instance, which of course created benefits, but also then uh, had huge they created value, but then they also captured a lot of that value and concentrated a lot of wealth and power in the hands of a few people. And then when you have monopolies, of course, they can exercise bargaining power, and then at the expense of both sides of the market. So now in India, this thinking of digital public infrastructure is being extended to e-commerce, and there's a move away from platforms towards protocols. So to move away from centralized intermediaries like Amazon or silos, which then cause a barrier to entry, and you move from the store of value to a flow of value. So the network enables flows of value, and you create an open and equitable and inclusive e-commerce network. So the first application of that is something called Open Network Digital Commerce in India. It's an open transaction network which is programmable, it's innovation friendly, it's digital. It's based on a universal open source transaction protocol called Beacon. And this open network digital commerce, which is peer to peer commerce, has scaled very dramatically in the last few months. That idea has also been extended to mobility, where if you have something like Uber, for instance, where Uber is the platform that inserts itself between drivers and riders, then Uber captures a lot of that value. But if you have an open network, then you don't have a platform, and that extra value that the platform is taking can be shared directly between drivers and riders. So this kind of peer-to-peer mobility has taken off as well in India, in my hometown. And then the third application is to energy, where people may have spare energy because they have solar panels or they have an electric vehicle and they can store that energy in a battery. Because now the internet and the grid can be financialized as well through mobile payments, you can have a unified energy interface where there can be peer to peer energy transactions. And this too is expanding very fast in India. Finally, I want to talk about how this impinges on AI. So there are lots of developments in emerging markets around AI. The question is, how do we make this affordable, inclusive, and frugal? And I'll talk about this particular company in India, which I know very well because one of the founders, Vivek Raghavan, was a classmate of mine in IIT. We studied engineering together many years ago. And he set up this company, Sarvam.ai, shortly after ChatGPT came out. So when ChatGPT came out, he and his founder realized that this was a huge opportunity for countries like India. A generative AI could be huge because things that were never possible before at a very affordable price point were now possible. So, for instance, with generative AI, it could be possible to offer every child in India and rural India a personal tutor on a phone in their language in voice. Or every Indian could have access to a personal physician on their phone in their language in voice. But the idea was how to do this frugally, because if it was done the way that ChatGPT had done, there wouldn't be the resources in a country like India, and it would then not be affordable. So, given that India has a tradition of doing tech differently and frugally, what my friend at Sarvam said is we can do a lot of prompt engineering, but that's only playing. The risk is that we would be completely dependent on OpenAI or Google. And so, what they're trying to do is create an Indian company that understands the space in a powerful way and develop their own large language models, which are more frugal, which are in specific domains like education or health, and in specific local languages. And so all this success with digital public infrastructure in India is sort of adding to our understanding of the internet, where the internet in the US has become something dominated by the large companies. There's very little checks on them now. Or in Europe, where Brussels tries to place checks by regulating and fining these companies, but frankly, that doesn't have much of an effect. Or in Beijing, where the state is very heavy handed and clamps down on activities from Alibaba and others if it doesn't like what's going on. So, a fourth way is now opening up, which we see in digital public infrastructure in countries like India, where you don't have either the corporations dominating nor the state dominating. You have a kind of public private partnership where there is much more, there are open peer to peer networks rather than platforms, whether the platforms are run by the state or by the private sector. So, India, let me just say for those of you who are doing research, there's a lot of research questions here. Like, you could start by mapping the ecosystem in Nigeria. Where is frugal innovation flourishing? Why? How can you encourage this kind of locally oriented frugal innovation across sectors, including in AI? What are some of the public private policy initiatives that can be used to scale these initiatives? How should you study frugal innovation that is done by marginal groups and that impacts marginal groups? And if you're interested in circular economy, how can sustainable models be supported? So these are just a few questions that I'm raising. I'm sure you can think of many that are relevant to you. There are, of course, many methodological issues. Emmanuel told me that there may be people from different parts of the university. I was recently in Brazil, where they do a lot of frugal innovation, particularly in the agriculture sector. And there, this research combines people in engineering who understand, who come up with, let's say, devices, agricultural machinery to process agri-waste, with business people, business school people who understand about business models and scalability, with people from the social sciences who have training in how to understand user needs, how to evaluate social impact, etc. I'd also make a case that this kind of study of frugal innovation requires multidisciplinary methods, both quantitative methods to do with cost analysis, impact evaluation, etc., but also qualitative analysis through ethnography, case studies, and so on. It also lends itself to entrepreneurial activity where you can have living labs where there's co-creation between users, communities, and multi-stakeholders. And finally, if you're doing digital type innovation, or even if you're not and you're collecting data sets, think about how you might share these data sets and how you might share codes and so on to be able to scale research across contexts. And of course, if there's a practical element, there's an entrepreneurial element, both in the state or in the private sector, thinking about how these research insights can shape regulations, working with the government there, or working between governments, communities, and companies to look at partnerships of scaling these ideas, identifying models for scaling pilot successes. Finally, if you're thinking about publishing your research, I curate a special collection of papers at this journal called Customer Needs and Solutions, which is a special collection of papers on the global south. We are focusing on how innovation, frugal approaches, and indigenous practices respond to rapidly evolving market, social, and sustainability demands in developing countries. We're looking at you to develop alternative models and strategies that are rooted in the lived realities of people from the global south. We're looking for empirical studies, case studies, conceptual advances that may be relevant to academics and policymakers. I added this slide just before the presentation because Emmanuel told me that there may be interest in working with Cambridge. At Cambridge, we have this research fund which has been set up to catalyze new and strengthen existing collaborations between researchers in Africa and Cambridge. The awards are made to pairs of researchers, one from an African university and one from Cambridge. And the African applicant must be based in any African country. There are no longer restrictions from sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, the fund encourages applications across all academic subject areas. So I was saying to Emmanuel, if you want to jumpstart a relationship with researchers in a department in your field in Cambridge, best way is to reach out to relevant people in that department, try and engage them in a research project, see if you can apply for joint funding, and then come to Cambridge for a few weeks. I think it's usually a term. And that will help a lot in building links and will lead to all kinds of subsequent activities. So let me just conclude that based on my research over the last few years, I really believe that this kind of frugal, flexible, inclusive innovation, including in AI, is a powerful lever for tackling society's deeper challenges, but also has lots of academic relevance. I think your dynamic ecosystem can lead the world in creating these frugal solutions that are used not only in Nigeria and other African countries, but in other developing countries around the world. And also that by bridging disciplines across the university, but keeping people at the center, we can shape technology for the many, not the few. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing and very happy to take your questions and comments.
Oh, thank you very much, Jaideep, for that interesting talk. I'll just open up for people to ask questions and interact. So the question type will be, if you want to ask questions, you can just raise up your hand and you'll be allowed to ask questions. But just to kickstart, my question will be, now, one of the challenges we have within the context of most of our universities in Nigeria is that we do researches and dump them on the table, and they don't get into to translate into to the market. So the question will be, how can universities like us in Africa institutionalize frugal innovation in our research and our teaching? How can we institutionalize it? We begin to have people solve problems using minimal resources available. Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question, Emmanuel. This is a question that many universities grapple with. It's not just universities in developing countries that grapple with it, even universities in the developed world grapple with it. This is a question that a lot of Indian universities, for instance, have been grappling with. So let me tell you how we do it in Cambridge. There are a number of ways we do this. So one is the university, very early on, I think maybe 30 or 40 years ago, when they realized that a lot of academics were coming up with technologies in the lab that might have eventual commercialization potential, They actually created the incentives to encourage that by telling the academics that they could keep the intellectual property, even if the ideas were developed in a Cambridge lab. As long as they published it, they could keep the intellectual property. And then they did one more thing subsequently, maybe about 20 or 30 years ago. They created a unit, they created a company, actually, a private company, limited company called Cambridge Enterprise, which is actually tasked with helping um, University of Cambridge academics, anybody who has any research idea. For instance, somebody in a lab may have come up with some kind of new material or a new molecule or something which may have therapeutic value. Any such thing, if there is a potential commercial idea and they have a paper that's published in a peer-reviewed journal, they can write to Cambridge Enterprise. I put the link in the chat. And Cambridge Enterprise has a very large team of people who have a technical background. Often they have PhDs and postdocs in technical areas, in the life sciences and in physical sciences. And they also have managerial, entrepreneurial, commercial experience. So as soon as they get an email from anybody in any part of the university about an idea, that project will be assigned a manager from Cambridge Enterprise, and that person will work with the academics to protect the IP, to patent it, to then potentially find a commercial partner to license it or to spin it out. So that actually is a very powerful basis, because often the academics don't have that commercial ability and that time or that interest. They would much rather focus on the technical side. Now, that's just one thing the university does. There are many parts of the university that then do more. Like the Judge Business School, I mentioned to you earlier that we have an entrepreneurship center, first of all, that does a lot of different things. They have many different programs. And so the Entrepreneurship Center at Cambridge runs that enterprise tech um, program I told you about earlier. So that's the training program for people who are doing PhDs or postdocs in Cambridge. Anyone can sign up to this. That department will sponsor them and pay for them. And we deliver all these courses and also supervise a group project, where they try to commercialize some Cambridge idea, supervised by an academic. So the Entrepreneurship Center does that kind of training, but they also run an accelerator program. So this is like an incubator, which is like a 10-week program, or maybe a little bit more than that, for any startup in Cambridge that would like to be accelerated. And so these every term they will take on a new cohort of about 12 such startups across sectors, and those startups not only get curriculum, but they also get mentored. And that's the key thing. There is a whole network of mentors across Cambridge, people who have sometimes a technical background, maybe studied in the university, did research, or taught in the university, but have also been commercially successful or have failed as well commercially. They would have had multiple startups, or they might be investors, or they may have worked for large companies, and so on. So that's just a few things that we do here to enable academics to be able to commercialize. That's from the university side. But what's happened over a period of time is, because of this kind of activity, because the university is an engine of new technical ideas and new commercial ideas, over time, what has happened is that we have people who come from outside. So we have large commercial, big tech companies like Microsoft, Amazon, etc., the works, who have set up research uh, labs in Cambridge to work with academics, and then to potentially commercialize those academic ideas in the big company. And we also have startups that locate here, coming from outside. So there's a very rich ecosystem in Cambridge over a period of time that has grown up and enables the people in the university to potentially commercialize their ideas. I think Patience has a question. So
Yes, so
Patience,
patience,
yeah,
you can go ahead.
you're on mute, Patience.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you so much for this very insightful talk. I personally took quite a number of notes from uh, the presentation, and it makes quite a lot of sense. So as you were speaking, I was just also figuring the fact that here in Nigeria, um, we're increasingly becoming more ethnic centric and communal in our outlook. And so you would find out that I listened keenly to your presentation. You made a lot of references to the government, being very responsive and taking the lead in this. So my question will be that, okay, so in a situation whereby the states or the governments are not taking the lead in making the environment conducive for this frugal innovation to take place, what would be your recommendation? I know that you have just talked about the academic environment as an institution and how that can also be a place where this can also be internalized. But then I'm also looking at community groups, like, so if community groups are going to champion this and take the lead in this, how would this function within this frugal innovation system that you are talking about? And then what readily comes to mind is an example that readily comes to mind is the kibbutz system that operates in Israel. So
Yeah.
if how do we translate it into our own peculiarity here, whereby we are becoming increasingly more ethnic centric rather
Yeah.
than you know focused on the state governments
Yeah.
and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Again, excellent question. Very, very interesting question. I can completely relate to that question because of my experience in India. And in fact, even though I have never visited Nigeria, whenever I have talked to a broad audience about India, many Nigerians will come up to me and say, "Oh, we have a similar kind of situation in Nigeria." So, like Nigeria, India is a federal country with many states, with many differences between people in the states, religious, linguistic, all those kinds of communal issues crop up in India all the time. And the national government at the moment is quite communal itself. So you can't rely on the national government sometimes. The state governments are perhaps a little less so and a bit more responsible and responsive. But even better than that, sometimes is when you go to the city level or the town level or the village level. Now, there you see a lot of community-based activity. So you mentioned kibbutz. In India, we have, and I'm sure many parts of Africa, you also have things like microfinance, where you have self-help groups, where women, for instance, would have organized into a joint liability group to pool their assets to be able to take loans that they share in a rotating fashion. So you have a lot of these kinds of institutions that spring up organically in communities and that then spur entrepreneurial activity. And sometimes they need a little bit of support. And in a country like Bangladesh, for instance, Bangladesh has made huge progress on human development indicators and economic indicators in the last 40 years. When it was founded in 1971, it was the world's second poorest country, just above Upper Volta, which then became Burkina Faso. And since then, it has moved steadily into the lower middle income, and its human development indicators, for instance, now are better than India's or Pakistan and so on. How they done that? One of the ways they did it, and if you haven't heard of these organizations, you should look at them. Two very large NGOs have been key to Bangladesh's transformation. One is the Grameen Foundation, whose founder, Mohammad Yunus, set up microfinance and who's now currently the interim prime minister. and the other is BRAC, B-R-A-C. BRAC in some ways even more impressive than the Grameen Foundation. And BRAC was a charity slash NGO slash social business that essentially began by focusing on it's always been community led development. So that has been their core focus. So they work with rural communities. Initially, they worked with rural communities to focus on a very specific issue that was very significant, which was child and infant mortality, which absolutely devastated Bangladesh in the 1970s. Very large numbers of children below the age of 5 were dying from diarrhea and dysentery. Essentially, they were dying from dehydration. And the solution was actually invented in Bangladesh, which was oral rehydration solution. Combining the right combination of salt and sugar with water could save children. It could rehydrate them and save them. But the packs that were developed, the ORS packs, were 8 cents a pack. They were too expensive for individuals to buy and even for the state to subsidize. In any case, the state would then have to organize the logistics of taking the packs from the cities to the villages. So what BRAC did was it started from the village up. And so they would go into villages, train local women to make this ORS in the home with what is available in the home, and then go door to door training mothers in how to do this. And they tested this out in pilots. They improved this over a 10-year period. They perfected this approach, and they spread it to the whole of Bangladesh. And the Lancet then declared this to be one of the most impressive public health achievements of the 20th century. And on that basis, BRAC has then continued to do things not only in health, but primary education, microfinance, social enterprise, etc. So do look at BRAC for a very impressive citizen-led, community-led, bottom-up, grassroots-based approach that has scaled to the whole country, and it's completely transformed its social landscape and its human development indicators.
Oh, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So I just want to follow up on her question to ask, one of the problems we have in in Africa, in Nigeria here is motivation to do research and to innovate. Because when you talk about the fact that in Cambridge, whereby faculty members innovate and the university encourage them to own the patent and then try to commercialize using the companies the university created. But we have situations here in Africa where innovation is not even happening because of a lot of factors happening. So the question will be, how do you think? I'm asking this question because the director of research is trying to find out how do we do that in the university. How do you think we can motivate staff members in the university to innovate in the context of scarcity? Because if they don't innovate, um, um, it will be difficult to scale, to have spin-off companies and all of that. So we have that challenge. What are the practical ways to motivate staff members to innovate? Because we may not be able to give them money in terms of salary, but we're thinking of if there are few things we can do to motivate staff members to innovate, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, great question. And I'll suggest one approach that we use and that I've seen used quite successfully in India. Now, may not necessarily work for you, but let me outline it anyway. So this is an approach that engages students as well. So students are a huge resource. That's the way I see them. They're a huge source of energy, ideas, idealism, enthusiasm, and connection to the communities in which universities operate. At least in a place like Cambridge, they come from many different parts of the world with knowledge of with very different backgrounds. And actually, to Patience's question, universities are a place where people from different communities can potentially live together and work together. So how do we use students as a resource to energize and motivate academics to do research? It's to embed in the curriculum and as part of the teaching, research-based or action-based research initiatives. So all our students in the business school here in Cambridge, across the different levels, whether it's undergraduate, masters, part-time, senior people, etc., they all do projects with local organizations. In the very first term, they do group-based, and these are all group-based projects, supervised by an academic. And they work on a real problem that a local organization, could be government, could be private sector, could be NGO, whatever, is facing. And the students try to come up with a solution. This solution, if they're in a technical department discipline, it could be a technical solution. It could be something where they develop a machine or a prototype or a system. If they're in a social science, they could come up, or in a business school, they could come up with some kind of social business or a social organization or a social business model. So this kind of practical based work that's integrated into the curriculum, involving the students and the academics, is a benefit to everyone. The students get vital skills that helps them to enter the workforce. The community-based organizations see a benefit of having a university in their presence because you're helping them solve problems. And the academics learn about issues, problems, real problems. They can get the beginning of a solution done where the work is done by the students. And then potentially, if you have an entrepreneurship lab, the students, when they graduate, can go on to set up a company or an organization to provide the solution at scale to that problem. Now, that's just one way to do it. It's not something that can happen overnight, but it is something that over a period of time could bring many benefits, including motivating, giving academics ideas for research and support in doing that research through the students and the companies or the organizations.
Yeah, fantastic. I will talk more with you, Jaideep, email on how, as a research directorate, we can come up with something for the university. I don't know if anybody has another question to ask.
Emmanuel, very unfortunately, I have to go now because I have a meeting with, as it turns out, a student to talk about research. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who participated. I sent some links in the chat. Do have a look at those links, especially the Cambridge Alborada Fund. Very happy to follow up, and it would be great to have you and your colleagues visit Cambridge, because that would be the best way to learn about how Cambridge has done it. I could tell you stuff, you can read stuff on the internet, but really there's nothing like coming here, observing it, and actually talking to all the different parts of the ecosystem on how it's done. And if you can do that, if you can spend a term here doing that, you can go back and try and replicate some of those things in your university. I've had people from India, from Indian universities, come and do it, and they have found the experience transformational. They've gone back and transformed some of their universities, taking ideas from Cambridge with them.
Thank you very much. Jaideep, you hear more from us, and will you be free to, I can share email to everybody?
Yes, you can share my email, you can share the slides, I'll send them to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks. Good luck.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.